On Christmas Eve of 2002, Scott Peterson called his neighbors to ask if they had seen his wife, Laci. He said she had gone for a walk with her dog that morning and never came back. He said he was worried. He said he had no idea where she was. The neighbors called the police. The police came. Scott Peterson stood in his driveway in Modesto, California, and told investigators that he had spent the day fishing alone at a bay 90 miles from home on one of the coldest days of the year, while his 8 months pregnant wife was supposedly walking the dog in the neighborhood. He seemed calm. Not the kind of calm that comes from shock. The kind of calm that comes from preparation. Laci Peterson was 27 years old. She was 8 months pregnant. She had decorated their house for Christmas, wrapped presents, made plans for the new year. She had also, in the weeks before she disappeared, started to suspect that something was wrong. Not with a stranger, with a man sleeping next to her. This is the story of Scott Peterson, a man who smiled at cameras, cried on cue, and looked the entire country in the eye while lying about something so enormous that most people refused to believe a human being could do it. A man who was hiding a secret that the San Francisco Bay would eventually give back. Scott and Laci Peterson were the kind of couple that people pointed to. They had met at California Polytechnic State University in the mid-1990s. Scott was handsome, charming, easy with people, the kind of man who made everyone in a room feel like the most important person in it. Laci was warm, genuinely funny, the kind of person who remembered birthdays and brought food to neighbors when they were sick. People who knew them described a couple who seemed genuinely happy, comfortable with each other, excited about their future. Scott had built a modest but stable life as a fertilizer salesman. Laci worked as a substitute teacher and was passionate about cooking and gardening. In 2000, they bought a house in Modesto. In 2002, Laci became pregnant with their first child, a boy they had already named Connor. By all outward appearances, everything was perfect. What nobody outside their relationship knew, what Laci herself may not have fully known until it was too late, was that Scott Peterson had a second life running in parallel to the first. In November 2002, 1 month before Laci disappeared, Scott had begun an affair with a woman named Amber Frey. Amber was a massage therapist in Fresno. She had met Scott through a mutual friend and described him as attentive, romantic, and emotionally available in a way she found immediately compelling. He had told her he was single. He had told her he was looking for something real. He had taken her to a work event and introduced her to his colleagues. He had never mentioned Laci. He had never mentioned a pregnancy. He had never mentioned that in 6 weeks he would be standing in a driveway in Modesto telling police his wife had disappeared. When Laci Peterson was reported missing on December 24, 2002, the investigation moved quickly. The community responded immediately. Volunteers organized searches. Flyers went up across Modesto. Laci's family, her mother Sharon Rocha, her stepfather Ron Gransky, her brother Brent, threw themselves into the search with a desperation that was visible and real and heartbreaking to watch. And Scott Peterson was there through all of it. He gave press conferences. He appeared on television. He spoke about Laci with what seemed like genuine emotion, describing their relationship, their plans, their excitement about the baby. He offered a reward. He set up a website. But investigators were noticing things that didn't add up. The fishing story was strange from the beginning. Scott had purchased a boat just 2 weeks before Laci disappeared, a 14-foot aluminum vessel that he had mentioned to almost nobody. He had gone fishing at the Berkeley Marina 90 miles from home alone on Christmas Eve in weather cold enough to make the trip almost pointless for any recreational fisherman. He claimed he had been fishing for sturgeon. He had no fishing license. He had brought no bait appropriate for sturgeon. Phone records showed he had made multiple calls from the area of the marina. His demeanor during the searches struck volunteers and investigators as odd, not the frantic, unraveling grief of a husband whose pregnant wife had vanished, but something more measured, more controlled, more like someone managing a situation than someone experiencing one. And then, in January 2003, Amber Frey contacted the police. She had seen news coverage of the missing woman. She had seen the grieving husband making televised appeals for information. She had recognized him, and she had a recording. What Amber Frey handed investigators was extraordinary. After seeing Scott Peterson on the news and realizing he was the husband of the missing woman, not the single man he had claimed to be, she had contacted police and agreed to help them. For weeks, while Scott was appearing on television as the devastated husband, Amber was recording their phone calls under the direction of investigators. The calls were remarkable documents of a specific kind of human psychology. Scott Peterson spoke to Amber from vigils held in Laci's memory. He called her while sitting outside the family home where volunteers were organizing search parties. He maintained the affair, continued the emotional performance of a man interested in building a future with someone, while simultaneously performing grief for the cameras. In one call, made on New Year's Eve, Scott told Amber he was in Paris. He was in Modesto at a candlelight vigil for his missing wife. In another call, Amber asked him directly about Laci. Scott said he had told her something when they first met, that he had lost his wife and that this would be his first holiday without her. He had said this before Laci disappeared. He had been describing something that hadn't happened yet, or something he had already decided would happen. When Amber Frey held a press conference in January 2003 and revealed publicly that she had been in a relationship with Scott Peterson, a relationship she said she had no idea was anything other than what he presented it as, the story shifted completely. The country that had been watching a grieving husband search for his missing wife was now watching something else entirely. Scott Peterson was placed under surveillance. Phone records, financial records, his movements in the weeks before Christmas were examined in granular detail. And investigators began to focus on a specific body of water, the San Francisco Bay, the same body of water where Scott had gone fishing alone on Christmas Eve, the same body of water he had navigated in a boat he had purchased 2 weeks before his wife disappeared, the same body of water where, on April 13th and 14th of 2003, the tides returned what Scott Peterson had put there. On April 13, 2003, the body of a male infant washed ashore on the eastern shore of the San Francisco Bay in Richmond, California. The following day, the body of a woman washed ashore nearby. The woman's head and some of her limbs were missing. Her body had been in the water for months. Identification took time, but it was Laci. And the infant, whose umbilical cord had been cut, suggesting he had been born or partially delivered after death, was Connor. The bodies had surfaced less than 2 miles from where Scott Peterson claimed he had been fishing on Christmas Eve. Scott Peterson was arrested on April 18, 2003, in La Jolla, California. When police stopped his car, he was carrying nearly $15,000 in cash. He had multiple cell phones. He had camping gear. He had his brother's identification. He had also dyed his hair blonde. At trial, the prosecution built a case around circumstantial evidence. There was no murder weapon, no witnesses, no confession, but what they had was a pattern so consistent and so damning that it told its own story. The new boat, purchased 2 weeks before Laci disappeared. The fishing trip to the exact location where the bodies were found, the affair with Amber Frey, and the phone calls that showed a man performing 2 parallel emotional realities simultaneously. The life insurance policy on Laci. The testimony of a neighbor who had seen Laci walking the dog, alive, after Scott claimed to have already left for his fishing trip. And the recordings, Amber Frey testified for the prosecution. Her composed, precise testimony and the recording she had made gave the jury a window into a man who was capable of sitting at a vigil for his missing pregnant wife and calling his girlfriend from it without missing a beat. In November 2004, Scott Peterson was convicted of first-degree murder for the death of Laci and second-degree murder for the death of Connor. He was sentenced to death. In 2021, a California court vacated his death sentence due to issues in jury selection. He remains in prison, serving a life sentence. He has never confessed. He has maintained his innocence from the moment Laci was reported missing to this day. There is a detail in this story that gets lost in the larger narrative, but that I keep coming back to. Amber Frey had no reason to get involved. She was not Laci's family. She was not a detective. She was not someone with a professional obligation to cooperate or a legal requirement to act. She was a woman who had been deceived, genuinely, completely, cruelly deceived by a man who used her as a prop in his carefully constructed performance of normalcy while his pregnant wife was missing. She could have stayed quiet. She could have let the investigation proceed without her. She could have protected herself from the public exposure and the scrutiny and the inevitable judgment that comes with being the other woman in a case this visible. Instead, she called the police. And then for weeks, she picked up the phone every time Scott called, knowing that investigators were listening, knowing that every word he said was being recorded, holding her composure through conversations that would have broken most people and gave prosecutors the most intimate window into Scott Peterson's psychology that the case would produce. The recordings didn't prove he killed Laci, but they proved something almost as important. They proved who he was. They proved he was a man who could exist in multiple emotional realities simultaneously and feel nothing contradictory about any of them. They proved he was a man who had told his girlfriend about losing his wife before his wife was gone. They proved he was a man who could sit at a candlelight vigil for the woman carrying his child and call another woman from it and say the right things in the right tone of voice without his hands shaking. Amber Frey wrote a book. She gave interviews. She moved forward. Laci's mother, Sharon Rocha, wrote a book too, a raw, devastating account of losing her daughter and her grandson and watching the man she had welcomed into her family sit across a courtroom and claim innocence. The Peterson house in Modesto was sold. The boat was used as evidence and eventually disposed of. Connor's name, the name Laci had chosen for her son before she died, is on a small grave marker alongside his mother's. Scott Peterson is alive in a California prison. And every year on Christmas Eve, the Bay is quiet. Next week we're covering a case where the betrayal started the same way, with a secret relationship and a partner who had no idea. But the ending was completely different because the person who was betrayed survived. And what they did next made Scott Peterson look like an amateur. Don't miss it.